So as we know, a significant proportion of what we understand in terms of the contributions to autism is that there's a significant contribution from genes and genetics. And we know this from studies that have shown that in monozygotic twins or twins that are identical to each other, there's about a 80% heritability. And there's also an increased risk once you have a first degree relative that's been diagnosed. And we know that a significant proportion of that contribution is due to changes in our genetic sequence that are fairly common in the population and perhaps combinatorial mechanisms that bring together different genetic variants that are fairly common that together predispose to symptoms within the spectrum. But we also know that there are rare copy number changes and protein disrupting single nucleotide changes that can also contribute to autism predisposition. We now have genetic clinical tools that allow us to identify those rare genetic contributions, either in the form of exome sequencing, which evaluates single nucleotide variants across the exome or the protein coding portions of the genome. In about 15% of cases, we know that there are large pieces of chromosomal material that are either missing or in extra copies in about 20%, and a small percentage is due to expansions in the gene associated with Fragile X syndrome. So the gaps in knowledge that we're trying to address include the diagnostic utility of genetic testing in the health and care of individuals who are autistic. And then what is the clinical utility of genetic testing, if any, and what is the cost effectiveness of implementing a genetic testing approach. So the utility comes from our understanding that there can be potentially opportunities for interventions once a genetic diagnosis is identified. And we're trying to leverage or facilitate that through a research infrastructure that will promote generation of natural history registries and collaborative research in the understanding of rare genetic contributions to predisposition. To better understand the clinical course of those etiologies and to reach out to community physician practices and families to promote education and understanding, as well as tools to facilitate access to genetic evaluation and ongoing care. Of course, there's always the possibility of family planning, and many times more than one affected child is born before a diagnosis is made in the family. So recurrent risk counseling is one of the areas that we would like to expand and enhance, and provide genetic counseling also in the context of the uncertainty of what caused, if anything, a diagnostic journey in terms of a rare predisposition to a neurodevelopmental concern. Now, we also want to use this as an opportunity to identify potential complications that can occur in terms of health down the road as part of a diagnosis of a rare genetic predisposition, and therefore develop a personalized treatment plan or care plan tailored to each individual and provide resources to seek appropriate care. So in order to reduce this diagnostic journey for autistic individuals, we would like to facilitate studies that promote provider and patient health literacy to understand the value of a genetic evaluation and of reaching a genetic diagnosis in those instances in which that is the cause. And then promote the least invasive method of genetic testing to reduce the impact of stressors in that process whenever possible, and collaborate with other nodes within the AIR-P network that are currently trying to understand how to reduce the impact of sample blood collection in the normal care of individuals with autism. Now, there's also a segment of educational advocacy that we also want to support in partnership with other networks that already exist, that are funded by HRSA, that are trying to improve access to care and understanding for individuals with autism, as to the value and the importance of genetics evaluations. And then, of course, identify individuals with rare genetic diagnoses, particularly among underserved populations, because we feel that there are significant barriers to access to care to begin with. But that gets compounded when you have a likely rare genetic etiology underlying the either comorbidities or concerns, co-occurring medical conditions, as well as the challenges of having multiple complex medical presentations that require access to specialty teams that can address each of those coexisting health conditions. So what we want to do is to implement an infrastructure for collaborative research that becomes a network of research partners to identify study cohorts or individuals, particularly when you're dealing with rare conditions, that will facilitate then deploying natural history studies for defined genetic causes of autism. Of course, we also want to address gaps in knowledge on the benefits of genetic testing and medical care for patients with autism, and the clinical utility mostly around the areas of anticipating healthcare needs, providing preventive care, and identifying those co-occurring physical care needs. And then, of course, participate in developing personalized medical either guidelines or plans that are uniquely tailored to each one of those genetic predispositions. Of course, we're also developing tools for medical providers to educate them, particularly in the primary care setting, for which findings of physical exam will be highly correlative or suggestive of a concern of a genetic predisposition in the setting of an autism or neurodevelopmental diagnosis. And of course, to provide access to genetic counseling when there are questions about when to refer for additional genetic testing, and providing algorithms or guidelines for how to implement testing both in the primary care setting and how to and when to refer individuals that are more likely to benefit from this kind of evaluation. Now, in the process, the intent is to enhance our understanding of the impact of a genetic diagnosis in patients with neurodevelopmental phenotypes, particularly with an emphasis on underrepresented groups, and to couple the early diagnosis of autism or intellectual disability or developmental delay with early genetics evaluation to enhance the ability to identify any co-occurring health concerns and implement a tailored plan for care. We also, in the process, want to collaborate with mentoring trainees, which is one of the missions of the AIR-P, and to facilitate any genetics projects that could benefit from participating as part of the network and providing an infrastructure for collecting data and analyzing it in an environment that's been designed to collecting data that is relevant to genetics registries and also studies. So prioritizing involvement of junior investigators in pilot project grants is one of our priorities. And of course, we want to leverage genetics into each intervention study that is part of the AIR-P to both understand the phenotypic spectrum of neurodiversity, but also potential causes of why interventions may or may not be successful, whether genetics could potentially bring some light into that. And we have sort of early discussions about perhaps considering as one of those projects the response to specific medications in the context of medical care, and why that may or may not be a failure, or there may be an increased risk for certain side effects from medications versus others. And how can we power the leverage of polygenic risk scores to identify the ability to respond to treatment or not? So I'll stop sharing right now. And this will hopefully be an opportunity to open it for discussion, and whoever wants to ask questions or further discuss our interests, we're happy to entertain those questions. So.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Again, I welcome everyone to either unmute themselves or put their video on or share questions or topics for discussion in the chat as well.
And we're a small enough group that we can sort of be very informal about this. It doesn't have to be.
Hi, it's such a small group. I just have to say hello, I think.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Hi, I'm Tony. I actually had seen your slides because I'm working on the group that is trying to think about LIN trainees and how we'll share information. So I'd actually reviewed your slides from something you had done before a few days ago, and I thought, well, this is great. I didn't. I had looked at the slides, but I didn't see the whole recording. So thank you for doing them again. And I appreciate that feedback. In my, just a sort of an aside, my hospital in my children's hospital is joining, oh, I don't have the names right. It's a group of a handful of other hospitals, and I don't think UCLA was on the list, but maybe of genetics. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have started talking about, I don't know all the names yet, but anyway, it's joining a group that has genomic information and will have a data pile to dive into eventually. The agreements aren't all finished, but the reason I joined today is I just wanted to I'm starting to think through that process. So I don't know quite what I'll have access to in this group of, I think it's 8 total children's hospitals with genomic information, but we are supposed to be able to search diagnoses and be able to do research there. And I'm just kind of starting to scratch into what that will look like. But what I'm intrigued by is that the goals you listed so far aren't so much about searching genetic. I'm a developmental pediatrician, by the way. I don't think I said that. It's not so much about gene studies as that education piece. And I'm interested to see how that rolls out over time. And do you think there will be more of gene searching or more of the education or a balance over time, just to get your kind of concept of how you think it'll go forward?
Yeah, I mean, the intent is to actually make phenotype a priority, right? So essentially the clinical presentation of individuals as a rich playground in which to understand what exactly we should be concerned about in individuals with any neurodevelopmental phenotype, including autism, right? So we want to, in parallel, sort of foster research studies or enhance research studies that are trying to collect that phenotypic information. For example, when you start with a defined genetic diagnosis. So if we have an individual that's been diagnosed with Cohen syndrome, and we want to collect a large number of individuals' medical information and clinical information about what their life stories have looked like, natural histories have looked like, we want to facilitate that so that for conditions in which there are very few individuals, that can serve as a node to facilitate more recruitment and a platform for deploying recruitment processes more broadly, right? Because what we're envisioning is sort of having a centralized registry that anyone can tap into and that can look into once we have collected enough projects and interests that can then tap into that clinical data, that phenotypic data, and understand patterns of clinical presentation, opportunities for what would be those interventions that would be more likely to benefit from either medical concerns or not, and what to prioritize health-wise, right? That can also help as part of guidelines, clinical guidelines that can be developed for those conditions as they continue to mature and evolve over time, right? So I think there's that aspect of things. Then there's also the genomic side, and I think that's the part that we also want to facilitate in terms of at least promoting the data collection side of things, right? We're not going to be a biorepository. We're not collecting samples for sequencing, but we want to facilitate aspects of studies that are doing that, that may benefit from having the phenotypic portion of that study deployed through our infrastructure for collaborative research. So we will have a lot of instruments that will be available once the platform is deployed that are intended to do that, to collect as much phenotypic information as possible so that when you have the genomics, you can then go back and find correlations that could potentially be useful down the road, right? So in between those two sides of the spectrum, what we want to is sort of also implement or enhance is our understanding of what are the tools in the clinical setting that will enhance access to care, to genetics evaluations, but also once you've reached a genetic diagnosis, how does your health become, how do we improve that access to health? So educational resources, both in the medical practitioner side, primarily primary care practitioners, but also for parents and families are going to be deployed. And the intent is that the website is being finalized right now. There will be a branch of the landing page for the genetics node within the AIR-P with those resources available. And the intent is that that will serve sort of a one-stop shop where you can go in as a specialist or as a primary physician to get access to information that other collaborators have put together and that we want to sort of provide a forum to sort of deploy and enhance a voice or a platform for them to be known, but also to develop our own interventions. And once they've actually been validated in pilot projects, either from the pilot grants that we have or other collaborators that want to use our research infrastructure, that can then be available for studies. So the hope is that all of those tools kind of work together in parallel to move forward the genetics field. Sort of a wordy explanation, hopefully, or answer to your question.
That helps. Thanks. I sort of, in my own mind, leveled up immediately to let's collect some samples.
Right.
But that is, I'm glad to hear that it's multi-pronged. However, if I am going to have some access to some biorepository data, maybe there will be a role for that as well.
Exactly. And again, the way that is envisioned is that if they're already existing biorepositories that are looking for collaborations, that are looking for individuals, that will serve as a landing point for facilitating that. And that is going to be represented in the webpage that we're developing as well.
Do you have a thought about time frame for that? Again, I'm not trying to get too far ahead. I think this is a big project that we're all wrapping our heads around, but
Yes,
just want
exactly.
to sort of find my place in it. Do you get a sense of the timeline for that?
No, I mean, I think just to address the finding your place in it. I mean, I think the opportunity will be for anyone who wants to either participate in an existing study to reach out, because there will be an online platform that would allow you to look at what already ongoing projects are within the whole network. And you can sort of use keywords to refine that search. So you can then sort of participate in those studies or initiate inquiries through that platform, which will be available. Again, we're hoping a timeline within the next 6 months, but everything is optimistic, right?
Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah, exactly. No pressure there. Hopefully earlier than that, but that's sort of the most likely scenario. And that will also be an opportunity for, as I mentioned, that if you want to collect samples, and you can use the registry that we will have as an opportunity to reach out to those individuals, collect phenotypic information, but also send a packet that will collect a sample, that we facilitate that as well, right? We will not be doing that process, but you may then have access to tools that will then get you to the individuals that will listen and will actually participate. So.
Thank you.
Hi, great presentation, by the way. I was curious about how far you've gone with the polygenic risk scores. I feel like it could possibly be utilized for identifying autism phenotypes in like females, because males can be affected more with like just a few genetic variants that can drive the ASD, but for females, it takes more of a multiple hit to cause someone to have autism. So if you could talk a little more about that, I'd be very interested.
No, and I think that gets to Dr. Whitaker's question, right? Which is that everybody's trying to find the largest data sets possible in order to be able to power a study that can answer kinds of questions that you're asking, which are very good, right? And that is the question of many times in females, we find that there's a late diagnosis, or that there's masking going on, or that there are that the phenotypic presentation or manifestation of the both behavioral patterns, but also the coexisting health problems is very different and unique. And you're very right in suggesting that there might be the power of polygenic risk scores to identify more subtle phenotypes that may not be as obvious from rare, more penetrant single gene or copy number variants. So the intent is to facilitate for the node access to those data sets. And Dr. Whitaker, it would be nice if you wanted to share the consortium that you guys are working with. But we only have 1 minute, and I think the opportunity will be to leverage access to knowledge of those existing biobanks and data sets to then facilitate that research as well.
I clicked it off, but it was Genomic Commons. Hold on, I'll pull it up again.
Okay.
And it had, I'll just go history back, and we're joining 5 other groups, Genomic Information Commons, currently Boston, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Pittsburgh. Anyway, good. We're excited about it here in Memphis.
No, but this is good to know, because
I don't
that
know.
way we can advertise it. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it's going to have lots of nice opportunities, but I don't quite know yet. So just trying to match what I know from two different places.
Great. More to find out. Okay, thank you everybody for attending.